Hello everyone and welcome back to the Experience Lounge podcast. If you are joining us on YouTube, unfortunately this is just going to be an audio recording for you this week. We had a few technical challenges with the video, but hopefully you will still enjoy today's episode.
Hello and welcome to the Experience Lounge podcast episode 39, which today we're going to be covering understanding Gen Z in the workplace. But before we get into the topic, Sasha, how's your week been?
It has been good. First of all, I'm going to say Gen Z. So this will be interesting because you're a Zedder and I'm a Zia. So let's see how we get on with that.
But we're also a podcast and a, how do you say
it?
And
a podcast.
Yeah.
Yes. So, okay, we'll see that difference play out here. But no, all is good. If you're watching on YouTube, as you can see, I'm doing swell again. Really, really swell. And yeah, just heavily pregnant now. So it is what it is. But otherwise doing okay. We had some drama in my house last week, although I know that these episodes will be released in a few weeks' time. But my husband fell off his bike coming back from the gym after going over a grate that wasn't, a drain that wasn't perpendicular to the direction of travel. And so he came flying off and has completely scratched his face, 10 stitches later. So the newborn photos are ruined. They're ruined.
No. Have you had maternity ones?
No. Did you have them?
No, we didn't either.
For the record, it's a hard no from me. And if you are listening and you had maternity photos, good for you, like fair play for the confidence, but I can think of anything worse. No. I'd actually rather set the money on fire, I wouldn't lie to you. But otherwise, I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Again, we're recording a few episodes in advance because of your Sasha's going on mat leave, and today is the day after the Queen's passing in the UK. So that feels, quite a somber day, I think, in the UK. Whether you're a royalist or not, it does feel a bit of a somber day. So
yeah,
and it's raining, which I don't know if you believe in symbolism, is possibly
absolutely. Yeah, it's sad times, and I think you're right. Even if you're not
end of an era,
it's an end of an era, and condolences to her family, of course, and all of those who are very upset by it. And I think it's quite nice actually to see so many people being very vulnerable. So yes, definitely thoughts and condolences there. But also, you are going on holiday.
I am. So because my son is only 3. I am one of those people trying to avoid the expensive school holidays. So there is a kind of, I think, a feeling, at least in my organisation, that everybody's kind of back from their holidays. And I'm like, I'm not. I'm about to go on mine. So bye. I'm going to Mallorca for a week with my mom as well. So she's joining my husband and my son as well. So be
lovely.
Good childcare.
Exactly.
Yes.
That was exactly what I was thinking.
I'm excited. Great. The weather's still really warm. It'll be about 30 degrees. So a nice little blast of summer before we go into the winter months here in the UK.
It wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think everyone forgets as well, there's normally a week or two in October in the UK that's absolutely scorching. So, people hunkering down for autumn, prepare yourselves. Yeah. Because I don't think it's going to stick around.
No. And it has been... And we've talked about the weather in true British fashion on the podcast before, but it has been a really warm summer. So I'm actually quite looking forward to hot chocolates and pumpkin patches and, cozying up. Not looking forward to putting the heating on because it's going to be so expensive to put that on. Heat the person, not the house. So that's going to be our mantra.
Put a jumper on. That's exactly. That was my life growing up for sure. But we have got a very interesting episode, as you say. We're talking about Gen Z today. But before we jump into it, I did just want to mention quite an interesting article called "Why Your Mentoring Program Should Be Mandatory." And this is a HBR article, and I saw it in print, but they do have an online version. So I will make sure we link it in the show notes. But basically it talks about, and actually builds a very compelling case for making your mentoring program mandatory. So just like a couple of snippets here, which I thought would be interesting. So During the first 2 months, and this is from a research study, during their first 2 months on the job, they generated 19% more daily revenue, so the people that had mentors, on average, than the 171 unmentored counterparts did. And the increase was durable, with more than 90% of the revenue gain sustained over 6 months. The article goes on, and it talks about how to optimize your program. So there's some practical advice in here. But it also looks at the optimization of a call center through mentoring. And it says accounting for administrative expenses along with the cost of taking mentors and mentees away from answering calls during their meetings. They calculated that the program generated an ROI of a whopping 870%. So I just want to call this out because I think it's a really interesting article. And as I say, we'll leave it in the show notes. But I think so often when we talk about mentoring, it's voluntary. So I'd love to know if there are any organizations doing this on a mandatory basis.
Yeah. I think like my experience of mentoring in the context of if it isn't mandatory, you sort of have to rely, I think, on either programs your organization's putting on, or that you maybe have a connection or you seek out a mentor for a certain topic that you would want. And I guess there's maybe pros and cons of that. So if there's like some really clear evidence there that it makes a big difference, I think that would be a good idea to sort of look at making it a bit more mandatory.
Yeah, for sure. So just wanted to throw that in there before we get started because I think it's a super interesting article. But anyway, Laura, over to you. So
firstly, we thought it'd just be helpful to sort of talk a little bit about who is Gen Z. I'm going to say Z. So Generation Z will soon surpass millennials. And I think, without giving our ages away too much, I'm a older millennial, but I checked the categories, so still in a millennial. But you are too, right? But obviously you're younger than me, so
I'm on the cusp. I'm not going to lie to you. So I'll be really honest here because, whatever at this point. So sometimes I see Gen Z is categorized from 1997 onwards or 1995. And if it's 1995, I am on the cusp. Like I'm an early 90s baby.
Yeah. That's what I thought. It's weird when I was like putting together the show notes. I thought, I wonder where Sasha sits. So
but I
don't have that. Yeah, I don't have that problem. I am fully in the millennials because I am in my late 30s now, but I am still in. So anyway, Gen Z will soon surpass millennials as the most populous generation on Earth, and that accounting for 1/3 of the world's population. And in the US, Gen Z constitutes more than a quarter of the population, and by 2020, so already happened, will be the most diverse generation in nation's history. And I did a bit of Googling as well in terms of, because I think with all the generation categories, sometimes they slightly
varies,
differ, don't they? Yeah. So the general consensus was 97 to 2012, which would sort of make the oldest Gen Z population kind of early 20s, really. But it could be, like you say, if it's 95, it's maybe like more getting into mid 20s, isn't it? So what we wanted to sort of discuss first of all are what are some of the key experiences at work that Gen Z are typically looking for? So what are your views on that, Sasha?
So I think there's lots of really good research out there, and I know you've got some linked in our prep notes already. I think one of the overarching things that I hear all the time that most people would hear is like this pursuit of purpose, right? So people want to work for an organization and in a role where they feel like they're contributing something more than just kind of the employee-employer relationship. So I think purpose is a big one. And that, I guess part of that would be that feeling of fulfillment. So coming to work and feeling stimulated, like they're contributing to something that's much bigger than just their role, for sure. And I know you have some research referenced here around the relationship between Gen Z's motivations and salaries. But I'm going to be a bit of a skeptic here because I think this makes sense, but I wonder how that will age quite literally, the value placed on purpose over pay. I feel will that age well, when you get into your 30s and you've got all of those responsibilities, will that just fundamentally shift? So is this something we've seen with all generations coming into the workforce, basically, is what I'm asking. But what do you think?
Yeah. I think I agree, because I think, I mean, even thinking, I suppose, my own experience in the workplace as a millennial, in your early 20s, not that money doesn't matter, but it doesn't in the same way, I don't think, actually, to what I think now in my 30s, where, I've got a child, a mortgage, like all of those kind of things. So I agree. I think, I almost think in that sort of conversation around hierarchy of needs, like salary always has to be there, doesn't it? It's sort of a basic thing that you sort of expect, because I don't think anybody works for free. Like, we all obviously work because we want to earn money, unless you maybe do work at an NGO. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, that sort of focus, I think, on salary. The big thing I've sort of read around a lot, observed in conversations, and it's really interesting. I was in a roundtable with other HR professionals, sort of based in the UK, Europe, like a virtual one this week, and one of the topics we were talking about was around Gen Z, and
Mm.
we did talk a lot around that point about employee activism, and that more so now than ever, I think Generation Z are looking for organisations that have a strong stand on certain political
Yeah.
or social issues, and they will challenge in interview processes, does the kind of website match up to the
Yeah.
reality, and make decisions on organizations that they would join or stay with, based on whether or not that organization does have a stand,
Mm.
and importantly, does it align to
Yeah.
an individual's value set. And I think previous generations have probably wanted to align their value set to an organization, but this feels that there needs to be more than
Yeah.
just, it needs to be a really strong position, I think.
Mm.
And I sort of reflect on that in the context of, what does that mean for industries, and financial services would be one, where typically more risk averse, more of a regulatory environment. How can you come out with that position all the time? That, I think, that sort of makes it more
Yeah.
blurry and challenging. And so I think that's going to be quite interesting. Is that going to vary across industries, if Generation Z are expecting organisations to come out with a stand, but actually
Mm.
that sort of, I think, in some industries is going to be harder than others. What do you
I
think?
agree. I agree with you. And I'm trying pulling up an article in real time. But there was I think it was either a Forbes or a HBR article that actually talked about, and maybe this is a couple of years old, but it was basically saying that it is actually better to not say something than to polarize your workforce, right? So, but
Yeah.
that's looking quite inward,
Mm.
not looking at the kind of talent market in future. Um, but so I think that's a really interesting perspective. Is like it's a risk appetite thing as well. Like you say, it will vary by
Yeah.
sector and by organization, and
Mm.
there are other things like, where is the organization located? Like, where is the primary
Yeah.
headquarters? Is it in a
Where's
very
the footprint?
conservative state?
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly.
So you've got to
Yeah.
be really, really careful. And I do think, actually, though, because a lot of the time when we say, are we taking a stance, and will Gen Z see us taking a stance, it's not just taking a stance. I think what we're talking about here is taking a largely liberal stance, is what
Yeah.
is really
Yeah.
what we're talking about. And
Yeah.
sometimes that's really difficult for organizations who have a very conservative board of investors, for example, or
Mm.
whatever it might be, to make. But I agree with you. So they want to see that stance. And I pulled up an article, a Forbes article, which is, funnily enough, sponsored by ServiceNow, who I think we give so much airtime to on this podcast without charging them. And it's called the Z Factor, the Z Factor. what, com-
ZZ. Yeah.
what companies need to know about hiring Gen Z. And actually, this was written by one of their interns, and it says, most of us start evaluating a company's culture long before we hit apply by looking at its website and social media, especially Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. We try to figure out whether it's a welcoming place to work. Does its website feature people from a variety of cultural backgrounds? Does it show support for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities? Is its online presence authentic or cringy? And so I think that kind of plays to your point of like, people are inspecting, you know, what did you say at the time, but
Yeah.
also how does that fit into your overall brand? Like, so I think the point I'm raising here is it's not just did you have a stance on a social issue like Roe v. Wade, but
Mm.
did you come out with a stance and say it in an authentic enough way that I believe that this is a reflection of your brand? And I think Gen
Yeah.
Z, they're very smart. They will know when it's fake, you know?
Mm. And I think the key thing is also, and I've probably experienced this in interviewing that I've done recently, for roles coming into my team, which has been, and these aren't necessarily, well, they're not Gen Z, but I think it's almost that people are interviewing the organization now more than they ever did. And I think the key thing with Gen Z is they're saying it's not just this stand of companies used to, it would be like, what does the company offer? And you would almost have to sell yourself to them. It now very much is, particularly I think from that Gen Z angle, do I believe that this company is right for
Yeah.
me? And I'm willing to walk away from that if I, don't believe that it is. And I think that's the kind of key differentiator. And I sort of think, generational differences perhaps between millennials and Gen Z is, if I think when I started my career, it was in the height of the 2008, 2009 recession, without giving away too much in terms of how old I am. But that was, where it was at. And to be quite honest, you were just grateful for a job. And that's quite a different mindset of rejecting, companies because actually they don't align
Yeah.
to your value set. Whereas I sort of feel when I started out my career, it was more, I need a job like post
Yeah.
graduating. So yeah, just maybe a bit different in terms of that mindset, but also perhaps even some of that kind of economic backdrop as well.
For sure. I
Yeah.
agree. The only other thing that I would add to that kind of last point, and again, it's more an article that I'm pulling up here, but you know, we've spoken about purpose, working for an organization, having a purpose, you know, contributing to a much bigger whole, but also this concept of meaningful work, which I think is, you know, very closely related. But I came across an article just in preparation on Business Insider, sorry, and you might have seen this. The CEO of Whole Foods says younger people have to earn the right to meaningful work. And so he was on a podcast and he said, oh, this is not going to go down well. So John Mackey recently said younger people don't seem like they want to work, partly because they want meaningful jobs. You can't expect to start with meaningful work. You're going to have to earn it. And so I do have to also call out here, you know, and maybe we'll get to this in question 3 when we talk about how do you build this up as a strategy for a multi-generational workforce. But, you know, you've got to make sure people don't say this stuff publicly because it will damage your brand when you're
Yeah.
going out and looking for talent.
100%, right?
So even if you really feel this way, you know, maybe just try and get your PR teams in as well and have a few lines around hiring Gen Z that you're all in alignment on. But anyway, I
Yeah.
just wanted to call that out before we move to the next question.
And I also think, I suppose, a little build on that, and we're going to cover some EX trends for next year in a future episode. But one of them this year has been that concept around quiet quitting, which I think is slightly misleading in its term because it almost just means, and I think some of this is maybe generational, that previous generations have sort of always said they'll work above and beyond. There's almost been a badge of honor of, being super busy, getting close to burnout. And I think one of the things, again, that's characteristic of Gen Z is they're not accepting that.
Yeah.
Work-life balance needs to be really important, flexibility, like we've said, the sort of ethical standards. And I think almost for the example you gave around Whole Foods, for them to say that piece around meaningful work is earned, I just don't think that would land with Gen Z, in the sense of they're like, well, no, because I'm coming to work because it
Yeah.
needs to be meaningful, and I will sort of do a good job, but I value boundaries around, my mental health, my well-being, work-life balance. And I feel almost COVID has sort of helped people reflect on that anyway. But I think this is also a generation, if you think of even what they are sort of taught at school, the sort of the focus on in school curriculums around mental health is just so different, I think, to previous generations. That all sort of makes a difference, I think.
Yeah, agreed.
So moving on to the next question, sort of thinking about this in the context of employee experience. So what impact does this have for organisations when thinking about the employee experience of the Gen Z workforce?
So there are a couple of points that I'll kind of shoot out here. The first is, I think organizations need to know that I would say, and I'm generalizing here, Gen Z are going to be far more vocal externally when you upset them and when things don't go quite right. And so I guess that's more of a caution than anything. Like, I spend a fair bit of time on social media. We've seen like Gen Z TikTok, we've seen millennial TikTok, work TikTok. It's really big, and so people will go there often under kind of an alias and will vent about bad behavior at work. But sometimes people do go public with it, and we've seen that as well. Kind of whistleblowing on organisations' bad
Yeah.
practice, or when things are going awry in the workplace. But also we're seeing the emergence of apps like Fishbowl, for example. Like, I love Fishbowl. I find it incredibly entertaining. So it's like LinkedIn, but for Gen Z, basically. And people go there to share kind of scandals, but also asking for advice on pay situations. They're talking very openly about their work situations, pay, etc. So I guess that's kind of one thing to call out, is organizations need to be thinking about that. How does our employee experience transcend externally? Like, how would
Yeah.
people describe this externally, and what does that say about our brand? That would be the first thing I would call out. But what about you?
So I think there's a need to approach the sort of offering to Gen Z, even in some ways different to how we might have done for previous generations. So for me, that would be things about how do we create robust kind of training leadership programs, but also think about, in that backdrop of meaningful work, the kind of focus on society, ethical standards, how do you kind of build that in the offering
Yeah.
that you're providing? So if I think, if you've got interns or grads or apprentices joining, what might have worked on a grad program 10 years ago, that
Yeah.
needs to look different, I think, in terms of the focus on development. I think there's that piece around hybrid working that Gen Z have sort of said, actually, we do value some time in the office, but it needs to be where we can be coached, mentored, we can learn from more senior people. But
Yeah.
then they also want that flexibility in terms of, I'm not going to give work, my whole life in the way that I think maybe previous generations sort of did that.
Mm.
So for me, there's sort of something about thinking about how do you adapt that talent proposition and
Yeah.
think differently in line with sort of Gen Z's expectations. And
Yeah.
without sort of moving on to the last question in terms of like how can you actually practically build some of that, I think it's really key that when you're sort of designing, testing, prototyping, that you're obviously then involving Gen Z in that experience, because if it's one generation designing for something else,
Yeah.
that's going to go wrong, right? In terms of sort of expectations. And
Agreed.
but I sort of almost feel that's more important now than it ever was, I
Mm.
think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking about the timing of this episode release. So this will follow an interview we had with Beck Smith, who talked a lot about passion and purpose. And so I think, kind of leading on from your point, Laura, as well, like for organizations, it's how do we facilitate career moves, transitions, development opportunities, so that it's not just about your role. And so, allowing people to kind of unearth their passions and bring, things they might be passionate about outside of work into the workplace. And I think that's a fundamental shift in how we think about opportunity and development. And I think we're on that curve. So organizations that have like internal marketplaces, that's a really good step in that direction. I think that that's a really compelling kind of proposition for Gen Z. Is, you know, you come to work to do your job, but that's not the only thing you can do. You can contribute to you know, other areas of the business. You can showcase your skills in other ways. You can find a passion somewhere outside of your functional group, for example. So I think that's also just like a fundamental shift in how we think about careers, really, that will benefit Gen Z. I think that's really important. And I think the kind of other part that we've touched on is, you know, yes, the transparency piece, but if you're designing for Gen Z, involving them in the conversation. But I think, you know, Gen Z are the perfect example of a generation that want to be heard. And so we talk a lot on the podcast about the need for two-way dialogue when it comes to employee experience research. So, you know, going out and asking for feedback, going away, building solutions, then going back out and validating that feedback and that solution. So I think, you know, looking at this as a generational shift, it's also going to build a very compelling business case for continuous employee listening, because that's what people want. What do you think?
Yeah, agree. I think the point about organizations that do adopt, as you say, that sort of internal talent marketplace, I think that's a great way, like you say, of being able to offer diverse roles but opportunity for Gen Z to be able to experiment
Yeah.
at the start of your career, when I think you very much are in that sort of learn mode. But if you do have a view around, you know, work with passion and purpose, like how can you identify roles, and that sort of kind of gig economy would be the way in which I think you could do that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So sort of final question then, how can organizations deliver a differentiated employee experience while balancing the needs of different generational demographics?
Gosh, that is a really good question. I think there are many things that organizations can do, but at the top of my mind, just based off reading that Whole Foods article, I think there's a really important change management piece here around communicating with the rest of the organization about why this is a strategic focus and why we need to be shifting our people, our talent strategy to embrace this new generation entering the workforce. Because otherwise, that's where you get these kind of abrasive comments. It becomes a cultural issue then between those who have been in the workforce for a while, even millennials versus Gen Z. You know, what we don't want to do is to create this divide in the workforce. So I think really thinking about your change management strategy, how you communicate this, you know, and getting people on board with it as well, and kind of and come with the data as well. So don't just say we're doing this because our competitors are doing it, but come to the table and have a conversation with your very diverse organization generationally and say, here's the direction we're going in. Let's have a two-way conversation about this. So that's what I will call out as my tip there. But what do you think?
So I think there's sort of a place for looking at things like reverse mentoring, because I think there's the role that perhaps those that are more seasoned in the workforce can play, but I wouldn't downplay that this is a new generation coming in with different expectations, and actually there's heaps that other generations can learn. So I think also looking at how do you sort of flex and adapt some of your key, you know, policies, processes, benefits, offerings to sort of meet colleagues at different stages in their life journey. And I don't think organizations have necessarily done that so well in the past. And actually, I think now more than ever with Gen Z kind of having that view that they do, I think it's pretty important to be able to kind of flex some of that offering. And then and this was a point that somebody raised, like I say, in the roundtable I was in early in the week, which I thought was a great idea, was bringing that voice into the room of Gen Z and actually physically in the room. So having them come and sit in a board meeting, which isn't normally a place that you would have sort of the most junior people in the organization, but actually I think that's a really good place to kind of bring that voice in.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think that's a really great shout. I know we're wrapping up, but there is one thing that I want to throw out here just as kind of like a cautionary tale for people listening. I see a lot of research out there on Gen Z and the workforce, and as with most things, I always have to look at it quite critically because I reviewed an article, which I won't call out explicitly, last week, that basically said Gen Z want to come back to the office. And actually, the research that was conducted was people early in their careers want to come back to the office. And so I think we all know this, but just being really mindful that like when it's a vendor sponsored piece of research, there's a motive behind it. So I think we have to be very careful with the research that we reference, especially if you're designing a program around this internally, because it can look a little bit it can be immature. That's my call out.
Yeah. And some of it's a bit clickbait, right? I think with some of those,
Absolutely.
yeah, those articles. So hopefully that was an interesting discussion. I think it's one that will evolve. I sort of remember actually being on things at the start of my career where I was the millennial Gen Y representative. So it feels interesting to kind of be, the kind of full circle now. But I'm sure more will emerge as more and more of Gen Z come into the workplace. So I'm sure we could probably do a future episode on it as well.
Absolutely.
But
Cool.
thank you everyone for listening. As always, please like, rate, subscribe, and do check us out on LinkedIn and also Instagram as well at the Experience Sound podcast.
Cool. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.